Good morning. Welcome to College Behind Bars, Access to Higher Education in Prison and the Restoration of TAP. My name is Janelle Niles, and I'm a member of the New York City Bar Association Minorities in the Profession Committee. I will serve as your moderator for today's program. Before we begin, I would like to extend a thank you to the New York City Bar Association for facilitating this program, as well as the Minorities in the Profession Committee and our co-sponsor, the Corrections and the Community Reentry Committee. I would like to extend a special thank you to Ms. Laura Sheik, Ms. Alvina Pillai, Mr. Javier Ortega Alvarez, Mr. Corey Brinson, and Mr. Philip Miller, all of which are members of the planning committee for this panel. This panel was inspired by the College Behind Bars documentary, which debuted in November of 2019. The documentary focused on the lives of a small group of incarcerated men and women who were committed to earning college degrees through the Barred Prison Initiative, one of the most rigorous and effective college education programs in the United States. What was compelling about this documentary was the transformation that occurred when the students began to view themselves as scholars as opposed to prisoners, and began to use education as a way to learn about themselves, the world around them, and how they would like to contribute to society when they return. It's a commonly held belief that a college education is regarded as the most common pathway to personal development, greater career opportunities or advancement, or better job security. With this in mind, it would make sense that college education programs would be welcomed, encouraged, and supported in prisons. However, the documentary depicted that college education programs are on the decline, face limitations, and at that time were not supported by funding from the federal government. And this begged the question of why. Why is this the case, particularly in prison, where the concept of rehabilitation has been used to widely shape sentencing guidelines and correctional policies? This panel was born out of the need to answer that question. And thankfully, we have an exciting panel of speakers to answer this question and several more. I would like to welcome and introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Vivian Nixon. Reverend Vivian D. Nixon is the Executive Director of College and Community Fellowship, a New York City organization that helps women and families most harmed by mass criminalization. Vivian's work at College and Community Fellowship and beyond advances justice through economic and social equity, anti-racism, civic engagement, and artistic expression. Welcome, Vivian. Our next panelist is Michelle Danielle Jones. Michelle is a fourth-year doctoral student in the American Studies program at New York University. Michelle focuses on excavating the collateral consequences of criminal convictions for people and families directly impacted by mass incarceration. Michelle is also a founding member and board president of Constructing Our Future, a reentry and housing organization for women created by incarcerated women in Indiana. While incarcerated in Indiana herself, Michelle received her Bachelor's of Arts degree in General Studies from Ball State University and also audited graduate courses. Welcome, Michelle. Our third and final panelist is Jule Hall, a program officer with Ascendium Education Group, where he provides strategic funding to expand post-secondary educational opportunities for people impacted by the criminal justice system. Incarcerated at the age of 17 and dissatisfied by the direction of his life, he committed himself to his own personal growth, development, and education. And Jule ultimately received his bachelor's degree in German studies via the Bard College Prison Initiative. Jule's participation as a Bard alumnus was featured in the College Behind Bars documentary. Welcome, Jule. Thank you all for speaking with us today. I have just one housekeeping matter before we begin. We will open the floor for questions in the last 15 minutes of the program, and questions can be submitted through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. However, just know that the questions will be answered near the end of the program. With that, we're going to begin our program. Now, I'd like to start the discussion with the history of higher education programs in prisons. Vivian, can you please provide a brief history of higher education programs in prisons for us?
Yes, thank you, Janelle, for having this panel and to the New York City Bar for organizing this, and for all of you who are in the audience who took the time out of your day to attend. There is a very long history of education inside of correctional systems in the United States that started before formal college programs existed. Prisoners would organize and study together, reach out to participate in correspondence courses. It is widely known through autobiography and film that Malcolm X got his college degree while incarcerated. But when Pell Grants, which are needs-based grants from the federal government that were created through legislation initiated by Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island, became available to low-income students in the United States, Senator Pell intentionally did not include any exclusions based on incarceration status. Therefore, students inside of correctional facilities were eligible to have tuition paid on their behalf, and colleges, knowing this, partnered with correctional systems, and many programs emerged across the United States. All over the country, there were programs that ranged from 2-year vocational programs with community colleges, all the way through bachelor's in liberal arts in colleges like the Barred Prison Initiative. Those programs grew and grew, and at the height of Pell, it was a very small portion of the Pell budget. So if you think about the overall Pell Grant budget, it's available to all low-income students who qualify in the country. The amount spent on incarcerated students was less than 0.1% of the entire budget. So it was a teeny tiny amount of money. Those programs thrived, and as those programs thrived, so did the level of awareness inside of correctional facilities around overall concepts of democracy, of liberation, of justice and racism. And organizing began to happen inside of prisons. There was a series of demands made, several prison riots, the Attica riot being one of the most famous. A lot of this was really born out of the educational process, that something is wrong with our justice system here. And while we have this narrative of rehabilitation being the foundation of our correction system, the pendulum has actually swung back and forth between excessive punitiveness and corrections. And we go back and forth all the time, and we continue to do that. Well, in one of those swings toward punitiveness, the tough on crime era, which began after the country saw that we were making progress with justice, the Kerner Commission and Johnson's response to it, infusing resources into poor communities and communities of color. Well, we saw that was working, but then right behind that, we came back on this other swing, and Nixon with this urban jungle narrative, tough on crime narrative, began this punitive trajectory, which ended with the 1994 crime bill. And the 1994 crime bill made these students who are incarcerated ineligible for funding for college. Therefore, all of the colleges left the correction systems, and we went from hundreds of programs across the country down to 8, literally overnight. The following year, much of the state-based companion to Pell also went away. So Pell is only a partial tuition. States also have grants which match. In New York State, that's the Tuition Assistance Program, or TAP. Pataki took that away in 1995. So that is the basic history of how we lost the funding. But there's another narrative, because people began to push back immediately in 1994. And after a 25-year fight in December 2020, Congress restored Pell Grant eligibility to incarcerated students. And now the next step is to restore the state-based companion.
Thank you, Vivian. Often the best way to determine the success of any initiative is to ask those who have firsthand knowledge. Today, we are fortunate to have two such persons who can provide just that, Michelle and Jule. Michelle, can you please discuss your experience as a student in Ball State University while incarcerated?
Sure. Also, thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. So I appreciate the background that Vivian gave, because it happened across the country when Pell was removed. In the state of Indiana, where I was located, the state did not remove the assistance that they were providing students. And so they used FOSFA still to determine eligibility for state funds. And that was called the Sassy Grant. And so Sassy picked up in '95, and we were able to see a continuation of higher education programming in our state, which when I came in '97, I was able to go right into college. I decided to go right into college for several reasons. One, I was already attending college prior to incarceration and desired to continue. And also because the particular facility that I was in at the time had a progressive orientation towards prison culture. And so and a culture of educational attainment was pretty much a foundation of the way in which the facility operated. So if you were eligible, you were definitely encouraged to go. And I went, and I was able to go to school in the evenings. You know, we worked all day and we went to school in the evenings, very much like a lot of people do around the world. But I want to back up and say that Ball State was not the school that I enrolled in. I enrolled in Martin University, and we were one of the few facilities that had two colleges in the same prison. And I chose to go with Martin University because of its long standing of being an institution that was located in the Black community, supported Black educational attainment, was founded on the beliefs of Martin Luther King and Martin Luther, the biblical figure. And so I wanted to go to Martin University for all those reasons. So in attending that, I was able to get all the way through to the beginning of my senior year. And going to school every day was an excitement that I looked forward to. At Martin University, there was a standard called reading and writing and speaking across the curriculum. And those standards were the same standards that they had at the university. And I loved being a part of a college program that didn't go through this process of dumbing down the education so that it fit what they thought an incarcerated person was capable of intellectually. I actually benefited from very tough English professors like Mr. Bill York and a few others and Dr. Kimbrough, who really pushed me greatly. I'm very grateful for those people. But what I want to talk about here is that I'm attending college at Martin University. It's going well. I'm about to go into my senior year. I'm taking advantage of the Sassy funds, which gives a student 4 semesters to get an associate's, 8 semesters to get a bachelor's. I'm going into my bachelor's degree. I'm going into my senior year, and Martin University is removed from the Department of Correction as an educational provider. Now, Ball State is here, located in the same facility, providing college programming, but there is no agreement between these two institutions on what can transfer between them if students need to move from one university to the other. What did that do for me? When Martin University left, and I actually applied to continue my senior year via correspondence and was denied, I had to transfer to Ball State. Ball State did not have any agreement or understanding or correspondence between Martin University on what courses would transfer. And I unfortunately was a senior who got dropped down to a sophomore and lost 46 credits of my 96 credits in the transfer from institution in the same facility. Ultimately, I ran out of the available Sassy semesters and literally had to reach out to people in the world to help me graduate. And I ultimately was able to find funding from a faculty scholarship fund And I think he literally created it for people like me who had to transfer at the same facility from one program to the other. And some Franciscan monks in Muncie, Indiana. And those people actually funded my last few semesters so that I could complete. And I think that that's an important consideration that we need to think about when we think about Pell Restoration and the possibility of bringing TAP back and other programmings. But because college experience is just so fundamental to, it was so fundamental to my personal growth as an individual. I think that as we think about options, we need to think about those things as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the goal here is to talk about how Pell Restoration can be student-centered. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Jule, can you please discuss your experience as a student with the Bard Prison Initiative?
Yes, I just want to kind of thank you for having me on this panel. This is a very important discussion, I want to say first. I also want to highlight some of the things that Michelle said before I get into my story about some of the challenges that we would still face with Pell now. That is agreements between universities about transferring credits, about relations between corrections and universities about the operation of these programs inside of corrections. So I'm so grateful that Michelle highlighted some of those challenges that she faced, because the fact that Pell has been restored is one step in a constant struggle to have a level of education that amounts to quality for people incarcerated, similar to people who are on the outside. One thing that's very important about my story is the fact that I actually was incarcerated in 1993, went upstate New York in 1994 when the crime bill was enacted and college programs were stripped from New York State Corrections. So I actually witnessed college programs in corrections and the way in which people were engaged, and then them being stripped away, and the level of desolation and despair amongst guys in the population because there were no constructive avenues for engagement while incarcerated. You know, besides watching BET in a prison yard and working out in the prison yard, there was no real constructive engagement. So, you know, me, I grew up in a family who installed in me the value of education. So one of my reflections when I first got incarcerated was that my life went astray when I stopped putting as much emphasis on education as I did in my childhood. So even though colleges were stripped away, I immediately set up myself as the go-to person if anyone needed help with their letters. Anyone had issues in the law library. I was in the law library as a law clerk. That's another story we need to unpack about the way the law library provided education for a lot of young men and women while colleges weren't in prison. But nonetheless, this orientation towards education led me to BPI in 2011, where I love to put emphasis, community supported that education, private funding supported that education. I always like to bring attention to the fact that my education was a community's effort, not necessarily any policies that were enacted by the federal or the state government. But what BARD did for me, it really challenged me even further. One of the first orientation I had with BARD, one of the professors sat us all in a room and told us, from this point on, you should no longer look at yourself as an inmate inside of a correctional facility, but as a student that's part of a larger institution that is BARD College. And I had been in prison maybe 11 years at that time and been ingrained with the way in which my survival to a degree depended on me understanding that I was an inmate. Whether it was interaction with correction officers or just operating in a facility, my safety depended on me understanding myself as an inmate. But here you had BARD College challenging all that for me and many of the other students. They really put us in a position to look at ourselves as students, to interact with each other like we were students in a classroom, to interact with the correction officials in a manner of a student. And that was so beneficial into my personal development, not to mention that I engaged dense texts from German philosophers to French philosophers, and the writing that was required and the way in which professors wouldn't let up on us. It has played a significant role in my integration in society now. So it leads to this idea that education and reentry starts on the inside, with people transforming their views from viewing themselves as an inmate. And college is one of the best ways, I testify, for this to occur, that transformation to a student. One quick thing I would like to add before I close out, and that is, we do need to pay attention to the narrative that Vivian brought up with the historical backdrop of this, because that narrative actually impacted people like me to make me think that I was a super predator, that school wasn't for me. But here I am getting into a college program in prison that challenged me and brought the best out of me and made me understand, wait a minute, there was a lie going on. There is something about anyone, any human being and their potential, that they can have a second chance and be able to develop themselves into their best version of themselves. And college did that for me and many of the others in the prison now.
Thank you, Jule. I know now that, Michelle, you are a doctoral student at NYU, and you are the founding member and the board president of Constructing Our Future. Could you discuss the connection between your studies at Ball State and the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. Really, really briefly. I think that you cannot think abstractly about being involved in helping people, or being involved in supporting people on their path to a reentry without some real tangible, actionable things that you do on a daily basis. For me, I care so much about providing pathways for formerly incarcerated women and men to be successful, that I'm not willing to just simply talk about it. And so coming on the board of Constructing Our Future, which is a group, an organization that was started, or the idea was created by an incarcerated woman named Vanessa Thompson, who is still in. And the idea behind Constructing Our Future was developed in a public policy class inside. And we worked with people in the community to come out once we came home to develop Constructing Our Future as a real idea, as a real program on the outside. Because in other words, the proof has to be in the pudding. You can't simply talk about great ideas about, helping people figure out career pathways and pathways to wholeness without actually doing something. It can't be an abstract idea. And so Constructing Our Future is one of those things. I recently also founded another organization called the Ujima Center for Justice, which is that advocacy piece, that action piece, that political organization that is doing the legislative work. But Constructing Our Future is all about safe, affordable, transitional housing and helping people get to either a construction track, because there are some people who really took to the vocational opportunities that were available inside. We have several Department of Labor vocational apprenticeships now that have been brought in to replace college programming. And some women have really taken to that, learned welding, they want to learn electrical. And so thinking about pathways for people to get to careers and not just jobs is what the education track is for. And the construction track is for people who want to take that construction piece that they learned inside and actually turn it into a career. And so we believe that's what Constructing Our Future is about, providing that. And we've spent the last few years on the infrastructure of the organization so that once we actually start taking women in, we can hit the ground running.
Thank you, Michelle. Now, do you think that you would have gone to college once you returned from prison had you not attended school in Ball State University?
Oh, absolutely. I was in college before incarceration. So college was always thought as a goal for me because my mother was the first person in our family to get a bachelor's degree. So education was always a trajectory for me. Now, this particular trajectory that I'm on, and being in the School of Social and Cultural Analysis, being in a PhD program in American Studies, was driven by the higher education in prison experience that I had inside working on the Indiana Women's Prison History Project. I was going to come home and go get an MFA so that I could run theater, so I could do theater programming, because that's my background as well. I worked with the Asante Children's Theater before incarceration, and I created an actual program called the Brandonian Center for Performing Arts. So I did all that when I was inside, and that was going to be my trajectory coming out. But it was something about this history project, something about dealing with the issues of mass incarceration, dealing with the incarceration of women, what happens to captive women's bodies under incarceration, from the origin stories to today, really captured me once we started this project. And I have got a thirst for it and an interest in excavating these stories, these subjugated stories, these knowledges about women and girls under incarceration that do not see the light of day, provided by traditional historians. And so who's going to write that history except for us, unless we do it? And so I have a real interest in that. And so that's kind of who got me on this particular trajectory. But of course, I was coming home to go to grad school, period.
And Jule, as program officer with Ascendium, can you draw the connection between your attendance with BPI to what you're currently doing now?
Yeah, so I work for Ascendium. I'm a program officer responsible for expanding post-secondary education in prison. We have a preeminent concern with incarcerated adults, veterans, students of color, first-year students, first-generation students, college students, and as well as students with disabilities. One of the things that I bring to the table is not only that impacted experience of being part of a college program inside prison, or like I said, I was engaged with the education of adults before I actually entered into the Bard prison program. But college itself has, particularly my liberal arts education, has given me this level of deep engagement, of critical thinking, of writing capability that proves so beneficial for my role at Ascendium today. It's amazing for me to get on a call with prospective partners who are practitioners working with programs, and the insight I'm able to bring from just having been in prison is amazing to me, because, you know, who thinks that when they're released, they're going to draw off of their memories of incarceration to do good work. Now, while that may not be the case for all people, we are seeing that many people who enter these college programs are coming home with the same level of wanting to engage society in a constructive way. We could have a big discussion about why that is, but I think it's the marriage of being impacted and having that level of education, and education installs self-reflectiveness, critical thinking, civic responsibility, you know, as captured in the film, that once people are released, they are like so determined to come home and contribute to their communities that we really have to pay attention to that. And that has been my case. And I've been fortunate to be able to land jobs with a philanthropic organization that was able to draw off of my impacted experience.
And so how do you think you would have been able to obtain those critical thinking skills to pursue a career had you not attended BPI?
I don't think I would have. I mean, you know, prison installs a level of critical thinking that is thinking inside of the box, literally, and how you should, like I said earlier in my conversation, submit to the notions and the projections that society make of you. So I was told that I was an inmate. I was told that I was a super predator. There was no way for me, I mean, it's particularly from the way society interacts and impresses upon a person for me to think other than that. However, when I was in college and I was given those critical thinking skills to think outside of the box, to be able to engage diverse ideas from across the globe, I was able to develop what the Germans call a worldview that allowed me to position myself in the world and see how I can interact with that world in a constructive way. So to say simply, I put the emphasis on my college education for giving me that level of critical thinking and being able to interact with professionals in the world today.
Okay. Well, at this time, I would like to kind of try to go more in depth into higher education in prisons as a model or a construct generally that can be used to help incarcerated persons develop themselves. We've discussed how college education in prisons is important to people who are actually incarcerated. And we touched a little bit on how it affects the community. I'd like to go a little more in depth into that. Vivian, can you please discuss why higher education would be important to people who are not currently incarcerated?
Well, I think education is important as it's the way we've constructed the acquisition of wisdom in our society and knowledge. And there are some problematic ways that we have given certain populations the authority to define what knowledge is and how knowledge is acquired and what constitutes as real knowledge and what's in the canon. There's lots of problems within the construct of formal education. That being said, education is a good thing. And the best type of education is the type of education that promotes the idea of liberation, right? Frederick Douglass wrote quite a bit about the ways in which education liberates the mind. And once a mind is liberated, it is impossible to constrict that mind again in the ways that, for instance, chattel slavery constricts the mind, or even white supremacists. In my mind, white supremacists are trapped in a prison of their own because their minds are not liberated, right? There's a construct there that they can't get out of. So for me, everybody needs an education that helps them to understand what the practice of human freedom and liberation really is in a society that's a free democratic society. There are so many other reasons that education is important, and there are reasons that matter more to certain affinity groups than others. So the corrections and policing systems, the justice system is very concerned with the ways in which access to education has proven to reduce recidivism. All of the literature says that the more education a person has early on in life, the less likely they are to end up in prison. Also, the more education a person gets while incarcerated, the less likely they are to return to prison. And even post-prison, if a person didn't get an opportunity to participate, if they go to school after prison, they are again less likely to return to prison. So the recidivism data is clear, although complicated because we've never really agreed on how to measure recidivism. But it is clear that education has a connection to how we define public safety. The other thing which Michelle already mentioned is that generational impact. She mentioned that her mother had been the first in her family to go to college. I remember my mother struggling to complete college when I was young. She was working full time, raising 3 kids. My father was terminally ill, and she just couldn't do it. Like, it was just too much to try to finish school. So she'd take a class here and there, but never finished. So my brother and I are the first in our family to graduate from college. But all of my brother's children went to college, my 2 brothers. So there is definitely a generational impact. Many people who are trying to convince more conservative thinkers talk about the economic impact on our society, that people who have college degrees contribute more to our economy in the form of labor, in the form of taxes, in many, they're homeowners, that there's just a whole, of, what do they call it? A domino effect of getting an education that has a broad impact on society. And that's for anybody who gets an education, whether they are connected to the justice system or not. But for me, it is a moral issue. That if we're going to be a society that defines public safety in the way that we define it, and chooses, at least at this time in human history, that one way to guarantee public safety is to have an element of punitiveness in our justice system that includes incarceration, we are obligated, we are duty bound, in my view, to provide those incarcerated people with access to the things that are going to produce their well-being, just because it is the right thing to do and because their humanity matters.
Thank you, Vivian. Jule and Michelle, in prior conversations that we've had, you both touched on a sort of mental health element that exists for incarcerated persons who attend higher education prison programs. Could you both discuss that? We can start with Michelle.
Sure. I think we were talking about how people in prison are classified, and you receive an actual series of letters and numbers behind your name that classify you based on the length of sentence you have, your mental health, your physical health, and your education. And I think me and you were talking about people who are classified as mentally challenged. Diagnoses are often discouraged from doing higher education in prison. I believe this is what we were talking about. And I know of one of my close friends who literally, because she had a guilty but mentally ill charge and lived on the special needs unit, she was told she could not go to college because who is eligible for a college, even inside the carceral system, is structured by a whole series of categories of who is worthy and who is not. And so the larger society doesn't believe that incarcerated people should have access to higher education because we've committed a crime. And then even within the system, there are categorizations of people who are deemed worthy. And in this situation, with a guilty but mentally ill charge, she literally had to grieve all the way, fight all the way downtown to central office to demand the right to have access to higher education. And so I highlight that moment because I want people to reflect upon the ways in which education is thought to be something of privilege, and something of privilege due to whatever status and category that you want to talk about. But education is a fact of right. And that's the orientation that we come from when we're advocating in our organizations and legislatively, like, if you're going to provide it, you need to provide it for all. It needs to be quality for all. And it should not have any barriers. If a student is willing to go through the work and the effort to pass an entrance exam, do all of that reading and writing and speaking across the curriculum, you give them access to that opportunity. Because as Vivian and Jule have already shown, this tremendous transformational effects ripple far out and exceed that individual when you give them that access. And so even people who are designated mentally ill or are mentally challenged in the carceral system and in society at large should not be denied access. Ultimately, she got access because she fought for it, got her bachelor's, associates, and bachelor's while incarcerated, and is now attending a PhD program in UC Davis in California. So don't talk to me about who should and should not have access to higher education. You don't know the transformational effects that can ripple out from that individual. I mean, she's doing films now. She's a filmmaker, right? because you choose to classify a certain person in a certain way. And so I say that for the in-prison experience, and I say that for the people who are on the outside looking at the carceral experience as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. And Jule, I know you were very passionate about the mental health benefits that are provided through the higher education programs. Can you please discuss that?
Sure. I think the docuseries actually captures it phenomenally. You see in the docuseries, people engage with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Alice Walker, and these texts that are capturing some of the struggles in our society today. And you see the students in the film actually grappling with these issues, bringing their personal experience. They may not all have the level of language to engage with it yet, but they have a resonance with the material. I've seen students engage with Greek plays and able to bring their personal experience, their personal tragedies to that classroom and write about it. And that is just so therapeutic. So that is just one example of the transformation that occurs in the classroom. But I think there's another instance that we overlook, and that is the community it develops, particularly amongst people incarcerated, because we are trained to be individuals, even in society, but to only worry about ourselves. But you see in the film, students coming together to support each other. That's therapeutic, you know, and help each other through the challenges. And these traits are traits that you develop and keep with you as you go along in your life. So those are just a couple examples of how I've seen and witnessed it, education engage and transform people with mental health struggles.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I remember watching the film and seeing how some of the students were able to then give a voice to this struggle by learning about struggles that had occurred in history. They were able to see that they weren't alone, that this has happened before, and that it may actually be common for people to undergo these sort of trials and tribulations. And so, yeah, it spoke volumes to me. I wanted to touch on something that both Michelle and Vivian discussed about universal, kind of like who should receive a higher education, right? I think there's like an argument between whether it should be universally applied, or whether, as in the film, there were these certain limitations. I believe that students had to be they had to be released within the next 5 years to participate in the program. And even though it did not matter what their crime was, they did need to be someone who met these certain levels of criteria, and to be someone who was primed, who would be leaving soon to participate. Vivian,
just really quickly,
sure.
I'm not sure that's not the BARD program. BPI didn't have those restrictions as you needed 5 years to release. I know not when I was in the program. I just wanted to be clear that that wasn't the BPI program.
Oh, okay. So then it must have been one of the articles that I read that discussed that. But I read somewhere. So with respect to BARD, what were the limitations for people to participate, if there were any?
There weren't any. I mean, you know, you just had to fulfill the requirements like a student in the free world. You had to write an essay and take a test to begin. Now, was it competitive? Was there enough seats for everyone? There's, you know, matters we could discuss with that. But as long as you were able to take that test, write a good essay, bring attention to yourself, have an interview, and pass that interview just like students in the street, you were able to enroll in the college program.
Let me just separate the issue of what the college's requirements are and what the Department of Corrections requirements are, because they're two different things. And the rules of a Department of Corrections vary state to state. There is no federal guideline about who can or cannot access college in prison in particular. Now, there's guidelines around who can access Pell, and thankfully we were able to pass Pell with no restrictions. But in the time period you were talking about with BARD, at the state level, correction systems had the authority to determine whether or not people needed to be 5 years from release, whether or not they were restricted by the nature of their conviction. But it wasn't the colleges making those decisions. It was the state departments of corrections.
Thank you for the clarifications.
No worries, no worries. And so we were grateful that we were able to get Pell back without these types of restrictions, because they're really false restrictions. Oftentimes, a person will look like they have a life sentence. Many people who on paper have a life sentence do not serve life sentences. It may look like a person has 20 years before they make parole, and then all of a sudden a law gets changed and resentencing happens and they're out in 5 years. So there's just no way to guarantee the length of a sentence in a system that has indeterminate sentencing. So that's one reason we didn't want to have that restriction. And because if you believe that human beings are capable of change, then you believe all human beings are capable of change. And if education is one of the ways, one of the most effective tools toward change or transformation, or I define it as liberation, because transformation implies something, that you're going from something negative into something positive, which is defined by the dominant culture. So I would prefer to say liberation rather than transformation. All people should have access to that opportunity. And there's all kinds of reasons why for some people it doesn't work, because there is the issue of trauma. You've already brought up mental health. Like, people don't end up in prison out of nowhere. It's a combination of injustice, laws and policies that aren't working for our communities, and also deeply rooted trauma and damage that causes behaviors that we don't know what to do with. And because we don't know how to deal with the behavior or address the trauma, we incarcerate people. But everybody should have access. There should be no restrictions. Pell Grants right now do not have any restrictions. And we're hoping that there's not the ability for states and for institutions to impose restrictions that the Pell Grant restoration does not impose.
Right, because doing so, I see it as an injustice. Because if you're talking about someone's quality of life and the value that education has to someone's quality of life, whether or not they go home, right? It matters. It matters for the women in the facility that I was in who were long-termers, who were the leaders in the community, who were clerks in all the positions, major positions, to also have access to a higher education in prison simply because they were, even though they were serving a long sentence. So also of the two people who I knew who were on death row, who came in with death row, right? Meaning they're supposed to die in prison. Both of those human beings went home. Both of them. Think on that a minute. So it makes no sense to deny someone access to a higher education while they're incarcerated based on sentence. It's insane. And lastly, I'd like to say, because Jule and Vivian have already addressed most of the issues here. It's about changing and fostering under the cesspools that can be incarceration, a educational attainment culture. That type of culture makes it a little bit easier to exist in a cesspool. Prisons are not, like people say, oh, well, they're over there getting free education. It must be a resort. No. Prisons are oppressive, repressive, choking places of desperation and pain. Let's just keep it real. And so if you are able to foster an education attainment culture, everything else, people can stretch, move a little bit, expand their minds, be more creative. And it's something that's, and obtaining their higher education is something that I don't know, I held it up as a very special thing because it was something I had to struggle for. Okay, so, Miss Vivian is talking about liberation. Well, Black liberation is those things, is the things that we fight for through struggle to earn, to capture, to hold. And so it means so much more for us, because it's not given by the state. It's not given. Yes, they're giving us access to it, but it's not given that like I'm gonna give you a degree. No, I had to work for that. I earned it under the carceral geography of a prison that is oppressive and repressive in every kind of way. So you to fathom taking that away from someone simply because of crime of conviction, to me, is the complete opposite of quote unquote carceral rehabilitation, that label that they try to say that, we're all about rehabilitation. You couldn't possibly, because you erode prison culture that is toward educational attainment. You erode it when you don't make it available for all. You actually create situations where people now are in competition, competing for minimum resources, and you create levels of lack and scarcity that are necessary. So yeah, really, go ahead, Joel.
Just really quickly, I just want to add this: officers appreciate having college programs in prison because the people in prison are more concerned with getting their work done. There's no conflict. So just wanted to highlight and emphasize what Michelle is describing about the impact on prison culture itself is transformed.
Absolutely. I think you for those people who are able to get it, and you create that kind of environment of where everybody is progressively working towards a goal, that energy shifts and percolates into other areas. So things start to change in the chapel, things start to change in the children's center, things start to change in other areas of the facility. Women began, to me, what I saw is women began to be far more creative in creating solutions to their own problems inside. Constructing Our Future was something that was birthed inside the prison because we had access to a public policy class that taught us about mass incarceration and taught us about reentry and taught us about city and community blight, and Constructing Our Future came out of that. The world is open to you when you have, that kind of environment.
Thank you. I understand there's also a debate about the type of education that should be provided. So I know in the United States right now, there's this debate between vocational education versus liberal arts education, given the student debt and the lack of opportunity that exists. I understand that same debate is taking place within this arena. Vivian, can you speak about kind of this debate that's going on between these two types of education and which, I guess, the merits of which type you believe would be the most successful?
Yeah, so this is a real nerve point for me, because I'm really worried about the dumbing down of America. I really am. Like, are we really going there? We have already tried to reduce public discourse to 240 characters. I mean, how much worse can it get? Cornel West often talks about the difference between cheap knowledge, like acquiring a bunch of data and facts so that you can create an algorithm that helps you monetize people's lives. The difference between that, which is cheap knowledge, and paideia, the Greek word for deep thinking, which is wisdom, which is really understanding the world you live in and your context, right? Your contributions to that world, your ability to shape that world, which is provided by a process of real education that engages dialogue, that engages text from around the world, from people of different ethnicities and genders and periods of time and ages. It is a process of understanding the power of the human spirit, which is human beings are amazing creatures. We don't even understand how amazing we are. Education provides that. And not all types of education provide that. So if you're educating to the goal of sustaining corrupt capitalism, if you're educating to the goal of, you please learn how to do these codes so that we can collect this data and make this money, instead of educating to how can you use that same knowledge, that same creativity to change the world and stop us from destroying the planet, right? Same kind of technology, but a different thought process, a deeper level of thinking, a trajectory of wisdom and not cheap knowledge. So for me, it doesn't matter if your end goal is a vocation like coding or architecture, or if your end goal is to just be a liberal thinker, a person who thinks constructively and critically about the world they live in. Whatever your end goal is, let that knowledge be deep and let it turn into wisdom and not cheapen it as just a way to perpetuate capitalism in its most corrupt form.
Thank you, Vivian. I want to switch gears a little. Despite the positive impact that higher education in prisons appears to have, there seems to be a number of issues surrounding the implementation and sustainability of these programs. Jule, you co-wrote an essay in 2020 entitled Coping with the COVID-19 Crisis, which discussed how COVID-19 has impacted college-level prison education programs. Can you touch on that, on the issues that have been created by COVID with respect to these programs currently?
Yeah, it's really amazing because just as we had the Department of Education announcing that they would identify 67 new Pell sites for college and prison, we had COVID ravaging prisons across the nation, not allowing anyone to have these spaces of liberation like Vivian described. So COVID in itself brings so many different issues to the phenomenon, I like to say, of college and prison, because of the fact that it has really shut down in-person learning. Now, I'm the type that I feel like there should be multiple ways to learn, multiple access to education. It shouldn't just be one, but nonetheless, we should not downplay the way in which, like we see in the film, people in a room together working through ideas is so important. You know, that cannot just be captured with a tablet. Don't get me wrong, I feel like a tablet could assist that. But as far as that process of education that I believe is liberatory, that is so important, there is that interaction between human beings and willing to disagree, to say, hey, I see it differently in a respectful space. However, just to get more specific about what we're facing with corrections is that we have also a public health policy that is just not serving the needs of our society, whereas we have this notion that certain prisoners shouldn't receive the vaccine. When there's research that shows that some of our prisons are incubators for the COVID virus, and that is a harm to society as a whole. So there are so many issues that, you know, COVID has brought to this plate, but I want to give credit to a lot of the innovation of practitioners who are shifting to correspondence courses or using Zoom calls when available. I'll give credit to correction officials too. Some of them are building their infrastructure in a way to allow this to happen because they understand what impact college and prison has on the facility culture as overall. Now, we're not out of the problem yet. It's still an issue. We are not paying enough attention to how COVID is really ravaging our prisons, but nonetheless, we have a few instances to answer your question of people using hybrid forms of education, whether it's the tablet, Zoom, or correspondence, or a combination of all three to allow college and education to continue, but I would like to flag that is still an issue that we need to pay attention to.
I had a follow-up question, but I see, with the constraints of time, I'm going to move along. We could probably have a whole panel discussion about that topic alone, but I'm going to move along. So we've discussed the these sort of arguments for higher education in prisons. However, we've kind of lightly touched on the typical arguments against this initiative. Vivian, could you please discuss these arguments and kind of highlight what the objections are to having college education within prisons?
Well, it's the age-old narrative of the deserving and the undeserving, right? Since the times when Charles Dickens was writing about poverty, are those who are not living in poverty have made choices about, well, before we help people not starve, before we feed them, let's figure out why they're starving. Is it because they're lazy? Is it because they did something wrong? Is it because, they have a flaw in their character? Because if there's a flaw in their character, then let them die hungry, right? Is that who we want to be as a society? That we decide what people deserve based on how we look at their character, or based on an act they may have committed years ago, or an act that they may have committed in a state of unawareness of their worth as a human being? We need to get rid of the narrative of some people deserve help and some people don't. That is a basic underpinning in the Western world, and we need to get rid of it. People will use the narrative of, why should people in prison get a free college education when my child has to pay? Well, if your child has to pay, it's because when you filled out the FAFSA form, the government decided that you had enough money to pay. It is not because somebody in prison is getting college. It is about your income, because if you meet the income guidelines, your child gets the Pell Grant too. So it's equal opportunity access to Pell Grants. So that argument doesn't fly. We need to figure out not what the verbal arguments are, not what the arguments that are spoken out loud are, but what are the underlying arguments? What are the structures that these arguments sit on? What are the foundations of almost every argument we hear that denies people of color and people in poor communities access to resources? What are the arguments against a $15 minimum wage? Really, what are the arguments that it's okay for a CEO to make 300 times more than the average worker when 30 years ago is 2 or 3 times more than the average worker? What are the underlying structures? We know what they are. It is a criminalization of poverty and a criminalization of the Black body, a criminalization of the foreigner, the alien. So if we don't start looking at these really hard questions in our society, we'll start listening to these tropes. It really doesn't matter to me what comes out of your mouth in terms of why it's not good to educate people in prison, because I know what's coming out of your mouth is really comes from a deeper place, and that's the conversation that we should be having.
I think that those are very important underlying issues to highlight, right? In the history of this country in particular, how you are viewed as a person, right, based on your physical characteristics has often been used to deny minorities the privilege of higher education. Can you speak a little more about the parallels between the historical barriers to education and these arguments that are objecting to higher education in prisons for incarcerated persons?
Yeah, and I'll be brief about that. So I'll give just two concrete examples. I think the third concrete example we've already discussed, which was the banning of Pell Grants in 1994. But during chattel slavery, the early part of the history of our country, the slave states, when they began to see a movement toward the abolition of slavery, started enacting laws that made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. Some states went as far as to make it illegal to teach even free Black people who were free because they had been in the North to read. And the punishment, I forget which state it was, it might have been South Carolina, but one of the states enacted a law that made teaching a slave to read punishable by death. And you can tell they were serious about this law because they didn't just apply it to Black people. They applied that law even to white people.
Mhm.
So for me, that was, when I discovered that, I was like, okay, this is not accidental. Knowledge is power.
Right.
Knowledge is the way we move through this world and have access to the resources of this world. And the power to organize, to collectively strategize how to end slavery, the abolition, become part of the abolition movement. That a lot of that had to do with education, because there were abolitionist religious communities that were teaching people to read and how to understand those secret pathways to the Underground Railroad, and to understand even the concept of liberation, and to read the passages in the Bible that the white traveling minister wasn't reading to them, because the white traveling minister was reading all about be subject to your masters. But what the people who could read was saying, oh no, Moses said, okay, God said, let my people go. And the slave community took hold of that. So yeah, education has intentionally been denied to Black people. And then look at what happened in Brown versus Board of Education. During Jim Crow, the separate but equal education, where you had African-American communities who had no resources to begin with during Reconstruction, because for the 2 minutes that they had Reconstruction, when they figured out it was going to work, they destroyed that. So now you're in Jim Crow and you're giving people a wooden schoolhouse with no books, no pencils, no access to any type of resources, and saying that's separate but equal education. And it took how many years to get Brown versus Board of Education passed? This was intentional, not accidental. And then after Brown versus Board of Education, we started flourishing in political education in spaces like what? Prisons. And then boom, 1994, cut off access.
Well, amen, Reverend Vivian. Thank you. That was a word. Okay.
Yeah, you get me fired up and I just go to preaching.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
Honestly, I just really, and the only thing that I would add to what Ms. Vivian just brilliantly just dropped the mic on us is that all of this is the undergirding is all about neoliberalism. Like it is your individual fault that you are that these systems are impacting you such, or that the society is operating this way, and that you need to figure out how to fix yourself. But racial capitalism has shown that you can't, the way in which our society is structured, it is race and gendered from the very beginning. And I think that when people try to talk about capitalism separate from race, it's there, capitalism doesn't exist without race. And it doesn't exist without the way in which it genders people, women and trans people, and et cetera, et cetera. So I appreciate everything that Ms. Vivian said, because that historical breakdown is what people don't want to acknowledge. And in this current day and age of the rise of white nationalism, they're trying to say that the spreading of this existing history is a revisionist history, when in fact, the narratives the stories that they don't tell us in the history books actually undercut this story, undercut the truth that Ms. Vivian shared with us.
Thank you, Michelle. I wanted to move to our next topic, which references TAP, right? In the title of a program, we discussed TAP, and we've touched on it briefly. But Jule, I'd like you to explain what TAP is, and followed by Michelle to explain why the restoration of TAP is important.
Sure. TAP is the tuition assisted program that is enacted by many legislators. We have in the nation various states, and it's a patchwork of states that provide tuition assistance programs for foster children, for students of low income, for students with disabilities. There's ways in which the tuition assistance program provide funds that supplement or assist students to be able to engage the not only the financial costs, but some of the structures that obstruct education that we are highlighting as well. So, for example, we have the way in which we recognize as a nation, we recognize the impact that education had on foster children. So we enacted tuition assistance programs and allowed them to receive funds so that they could have a better existence in the educational system without failing or flunking because of the fact that they were in foster homes. So tuition assistance programs are a way in which we supplement our educational process, not limited to, but including certain types of special populations, for lack of a better way of describing it, people with disabilities, people in foster homes, et cetera.
Thank you. Yes. And Michelle, briefly, if you can discuss why restoring TAP is important, especially in light of the fact that Pell has been restored as of 2020.
Right. Okay. So TAP is important simply because you cannot rely on the federal government to keep Pell in place. So your state needs to get TAP restored for New York residents, so that, and make it robust and take into it many of the reforms that come in with the Pell restoration, so that it can be stable for students throughout time, because you never know when the next administration will come and pull the rug on federal Pell again, right? So it needs to be strengthened in New York. It needs to be restored and strengthened in New York State. And I can go through briefly in the ways in which it needs to be strengthened. For example, it needs to be strengthened. First and foremost, I'm just going to scroll to my notes. TAP needs to be available for students inside, regardless of their sentence, regardless of their criminal history. They need to have support in place to partner with local and community-based organizations with documented resources for access. This is what these programs who are getting access to TAP money should be able to do. And those students, and they need to be able to fully accommodate all students with disabilities in accordance and alliance with the ADA. They need to provide student affair professionals to assist students with college life. Those programs taking advantage of TAP need to make sure that those students can continue at a university upon release. And they need to emphasize the requirement in the law that the institution establish transfer articulation agreements between institutions, because students may be located at Bedford, but then shifted to Albion. And so while there's an agreement between Bedford and Taconic, with a transfer of credits, that's not necessarily the case at Albion. And that's also with the men's facilities across the state. So there needs to be transfer agreements so that students moving from facility to facility are not holistically disrupted. And so overall, it needs to be a student-centered focus. What should happen to the student at the enrollment, admission, enrollment, through the program and after? Student-centered. And that was really brief. I could go in more, but I know we are at time.
I know. I was going to say we have about 2 minutes to address the initiatives that exist in support of the restoration of TAP. It's really important to let the viewers know how they can get involved, what initiatives exist, and how they can get involved if they would like to. So, Vivian, can you please discuss? I believe it's Turn on the Tap. Can you please discuss that initiative?
Sure. I'm going to try. I think I'm doing this correctly. In the chat, I just put a link to the Turn on the Tap website. And there you can find much more detailed information. But here in New York at College and Community Fellowship, we're working with Michelle and with many advocates of other organizations, Unlock Higher Ed, Operation Restoration, Ed Council, Ed Trust. We're working with New Yorkers and people nationwide who care about this issue to convince New York State to bring tuition assistance program back into carceral facilities. We are having an advocacy day on March 16th. You can find out all about that at the link that's in the chat. Our policy director's name is Stephanie Bazell, and our organizer is Evelise Kalistra, and our policy associate is Bridget Shanahan. And they are putting together an awesome program. We're partnering with the Barred Prison Initiative and their policy staff who has been working with us very closely. I'm going to say Johan, and I always mispronounce his last name. So I'm just going to say, I think it's Tatro. He's awesome. So please do go to that link and learn about this campaign to restore TAP. It's about having conversations with legislatures, letting them know why this is important, educating the public about it. We're doing forums every now and then. We do Facebook Lives. You can sign up on that website to get frequent updates. And as a New Yorker, and many of you who are in the legal profession, we would love for people to publicly endorse the campaign if you have the capacity to do that. So please do get involved.
So we have reached the portion of our period where we are going to answer questions. I see there's one question in the queue. The question states, in our world, there are not so many professions: accounting, law, medicine, the military, the priesthood. Do some professions offer more potential for incarcerated persons than others? And should an incarcerated person aim for accounting, nursing, construction trades, such as a plumber, electrician, or a stonemason?
So I'm going to answer really quick. A lot of those other options the person asked the question, are literally locked out for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people because they require professional licensure. And so there are many job career trajectories that are locked out: the nurses, the electrical, because they can't get the licenses. And so that's part of the work that we have to do and organize, is to remove some of the legal collateral consequences that are laws that are on the books. And we know that the American Bar Association identified 48,000. They've knocked several down. Some people have taken some off. It's a little over 40,000 still left. That bar access to resources and opportunity, particularly in the employment and career fields. And in my state, the entire medical field, from the masseuse to the surgeon, are completely locked out. So yes, there's going to be challenges there, but I think those are fights that we need to be having. There shouldn't be a career opportunity locked out from us. Or then why are we enduring all of these collateral consequences? What's the point of incarceration? I mean, you need not incarcerate us if you're going to perpetually punish us in perpetuity for the rest of our entire lives. That's incarceration.
Yeah. And might I add, when you travel to other countries and talk to corrections professionals and try to explain collateral consequences to them, like people are still punished after they get out of prison, they look at you like, we don't understand. I don't understand. They get very confused. They don't understand the concept of continuing the punishment after the sentence is over.
Right.
That makes every sentence a life sentence.
Yes. Absolutely. Thank you. Mm.
And I would like to add, there's a portion of this question that seems to allude to incarcerated people being more capable of doing certain types of jobs. I just want to put out there, I'm not sure if that's the gist, but this is an argument that comes up sometimes. People incarcerated are capable and interested in doing the spectrum of things in our society, and we should provide them with the access to make that decision on what they would choose to engage, whether it's electric or liberal arts, but we should not have a structure which Vivian and Michelle are basically pointing to that restricts them from accessing that level of engagement. So I just want to bring attention to that. Incarcerated people are a diverse population that are interested in a diverse professions and interests. So we should not try to put them in a box and say, hey, this is better for an incarcerated person, whereas this would not be.
That's why we need to fight collateral consequences.
Exactly, I agree.
So we have another question. It says, can you talk a bit about the challenges that formerly incarcerated individuals face who leave prison and enter the workforce? If they're able to obtain an education or higher education, what type of limits do they have when they are applying for jobs in their fields?
Depends on what state they live in. Again, with the collateral consequences. Here in New York State, we have protections that make people with criminal convictions somewhat of a protected class. There's I think it's the employment law, or is it in the corrections law? I believe it's the employment law, Article 23A, that protects people with criminal record histories from blatant discrimination based solely on the existence of a criminal record. So there's a standard of proof that an employer has to offer that they did their due diligence to make sure that this person wasn't presenting any real threat to their employment place, especially if you get to the point of you've interviewed this person. That's why ban the box was so important. And that's the movement to keep that question about your criminal history until much later in the employment process. Because if you're interviewed for the merit, for what you bring to the table, your qualifications, and it's decided that you are the right person for the job, and then later discover that you have a criminal record, they have to weigh certain factors in New York State against that criminal record. That's not true in every state. It should be true in every state. But those are the barriers we face. There's work constantly being done to eliminate those barriers. One of the things we're asking the federal government to do is to say, all right, the federal government has banned the box. We are not asking this question up front. We are giving people a fair chance to be measured for their ability to do their jobs. And we're not going to contract with any business that doesn't do the same thing. Now, if the federal government would just do that, we could solve a huge part of this.
Yeah, right. Right. And I think that I would add that some of the challenges that formerly incarcerated people face who have obtained their education while incarcerated, or portion of that education, is that they often are not permitted to complete at the university that provided that education to them while they were incarcerated. And that's particularly true in our state. There is no law preventing that level of discrimination in the state of Indiana. And so you're at the will of a university who was willing to educate you while you were incarcerated, but treat you like dirt once you come home. And so that admissions in the schools is a challenge. Then there's levels within that. People who are trying to go for certain professional licensures or abilities to complete certain college requirements, such as practicums and clinical some of their clinical work and their practicums in the field of social work and other fields. They're often denied admissions into these graduate level programs because some of the arguments we hear is that, oh, we're unable to insure you. And so all of those type of barriers they are spread out, they're diverse, they happen at different points throughout the education process. I think also about people who are allowed to be a student, but denied the right to be a research assistant or a teaching assistant because they would then be an employee of the university. And so those kinds of hoops that people have to jump through are happening all the time. And so then you take that, maybe you're able to fight through all those hoops and then enter into the job market. Then in states that have not removed the box, you're having to deal with the box. And then for those people who have removed the box, people are using background checks, because if you owe any fines and fees, or if you are on probation and you're being charged anything, or if you have your your credit history, has been a way in which organizations have been able to determine that you have been involved in the criminal legal system. And so those are some of the barriers that come. They are many. They are, and you don't know when you don't know when you might encounter them or at what stage. And so there needs to be some definite, this is why we do this work, right? So, yeah.
I would like to just bring some more attention to the background check. So from what I've witnessed, even when, not only in my personal experience, but with working with other formerly incarcerated people who apply for jobs, there's this process when you even get the job, you have to go through a background check as if you weren't straightforward about it. It's like, wait, we spoke about this. Why is this an issue now? The second factor is particularly, I want to say this has, I won't limit it to women, but it has come to my attention through women. There's a way in which there's a interaction with HR departments and formerly incarcerated people about your background that is re-traumatizing. You're asking questions as if this person committed this crime yesterday, or it's just really, I just really want to bring attention to, let's not keep this thing that happened in the past at the forefront of our discussions of who we are now. And I'm aware that in many instances, like I said, I know with a few women, it was re-traumatizing because they asked questions that are like, maybe even a trial judge didn't ask. So I just want to bring attention to background checks and being open to that and not re-traumatizing people who apply for these jobs.
Jule, and they also often ask for you to go get your records. So now you have to go to the police, go to the courts to retrieve your records in order to provide this history for people. And it is re-traumatizing. Or you have to write your own narrative of your crime and the crime you were convicted of and share that with it in order for them to determine your eligibility. And I think it's honestly, the underlying part of that is so that you can always be othered and they can always look at you and say, at least I'm not that. On a deep level, it is used as a measure in which to keep you othered and not an equal, because maybe your credentials are, and you got to think about these are carceral agents who are doing, in a bureaucrats who are doing these processes, and they see excellence and they see capacity and they see ability, and these processes are not laws in the state, but are practices that come out of needing to assess people's worth. Falsely.
Okay, so I have a question, which we have about 2 minutes left to discuss, but I know there were 2 other initiatives that I wanted to get to before we opened for questions, but I wanted to be respectful of time. There is Equity is Justice and the Ascendium strategy. Jule and Michelle, if you could take 30 seconds, I'm sorry to put you into these time constraints, but 30 seconds to discuss.
30 seconds.
That would be amazing.
So hashtag Equity is Justice led several major webinars and panels over the last year during a pandemic to fight for the restoration of Pell successfully. And it's led by folks at, it's a coalition of organizations working to, now we're working on the implementation of Pell. right? And that's along with Unlock Higher Education. These are all organizations that are doing this work on the ground, who are doing actual service to the communities, to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated students who are organizing right now to work on Pell implementation. So you can check out hashtag Equity and Justice. That is also leading the Turn on the Tap campaign. And you can also look at unlockhighered.org and look at the work that we are doing towards Pell implementation.
So at Ascendium, our strategy is to uplift innovative new programs that have college programs that have some form of learning for others in the field. We engage research and are data driven, and we help to foment multi-sector partnerships that allow these college programs to subsist. So example of the latter is working with corrections, the chambers of commerce, as well as universities to develop memorandums of agreements that would allow these people to create pathways that would produce a level of education for students that is not just employable, but meaningful to their lives as well.
Okay, well, we have reached the end of our program. I want to thank the panelists so much for this enriching conversation. I want to thank the Bar Association for the facilitation of this program, and I want to thank the viewers for attending. This concludes our program for the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Okay.